Hey everybody, Mr. Larson here. In this video, I'm going to walk through the evidence of evolution presentation. So follow along with those questions in the digital lesson as we work through this presentation here. So we're going to be talking about here all the different ways that scientists look at evolution, how it came to be, and how we can actually study animals over time. So evolution, the three main words that kind of describe evolution are these three right here. Change over time. So when we're looking at animals, when we're looking at evolution, we are looking at the change that these species go through over time. So a more specific definition are these two right here. So it is the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. So how we went from basically dinosaurs to how our species have changed to what they are today, and how sort of nature has influenced that. So another good definition is evolution is a process that results in heritable changes in a population spread over many generations. So these changes, these characteristics have been given to these species by their parents before them. So it's just that change of the different species over many generations or over time. So this theory was proposed by Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was a scientist back in 1800s, and he took a trip in his HMS Beagle around the world. So his goal was in order to study these different species found all over the world and hopefully see different characteristics. So this is just a map describing the trip that he took. So he started from Britain, kind of worked his way around South America, and his main port that we're going to be talking about here is the Galapagos Islands. So as we move forward, think about the Galapagos Islands, and we'll talk about the different species that he saw and how this led to his theory of evolution. So these are the main spots that he stopped at when he was in South America. So as you can see here, Galapagos Islands over here are kind of the main port. So when we're talking about evolution, we look at these different, basically these different ideas when describing when proving our ideas of evolution. So we look at fossil records, we look at what is called artificial selection, geographic distribution of living species. So where are they located as it comes to the land on Earth? Homologous body structures, vestigial body structures, analogous body structures, and then similarities in embryology, which you'll be also doing later on in this digital lesson, and then molecular evidence or DNA. So we're going to go over these in this presentation and talk about how each of these kind of prove or help prove this theory of evolution. So the first idea is the fossil records. So here you can see an image of basically fossils over time and how fossils are formed. So as you can see, there are different layers. Each of these layers kind of represents a different point in time. And as these animals die off, you can see that the next animals kind of die off above them. So as we move farther up the rock layer, we get closer and closer to modern day. And as we go farther and farther down, we go farther back in time. So in looking at fossils, we're actually able to determine not only when these animals may have died, but as well as see how they may have changed from past generations to current generations. We get to see what are called adaptations. So this whole idea of evolution really dives into what adaptations are. So an adaptation is any inherited characteristic that increases the organism's chance of survival. So these adaptations help that animal live, help that animal eat, help that animal from being eaten in themselves, and it increases what is called a species fitness. So the ability of an individual to survive and reproduce in its specific environment. So fitness does not mean strength. Fitness does not mean overall size. It just means the ability of an individual to survive and reproduce. So survive and reproduce, that is the big idea for evolution. That is the whole goal for every species, to survive and then recreate and reproduce within that environment. So adaptations happen in order to increase a species fitness, and hopefully it does. When we're talking about adaptations, we have what are called natural and artificial adaptations. So this specific idea of our artificial selection is impacted by humans. So when we're talking about artificial, that just means humans are causing these. So nature provides slight variations, and then humans select those variations that they find useful and selectively breed those offspring. So these are humans deciding what stays, what goes, and how we can influence that. So this has become a more and more common practice in our lives today. One of the main practices may even be in your very own home with dogs. So this is images of Great Danes. I have one of my very own, and they are just the best dogs ever. So here are pugs. So humans have influenced the species of dogs. So as we've domesticated them, we have chosen what characteristics we wanted to stay, what characteristics we wanted to go in order to create these different species. So these are all examples of artificial selection, including chihuahuas. Another idea is basically fruits. So we have influenced nature creating these different fruits in order to select what fruits are more bountiful, what plants basically grow better crops, and things like that. So as well as basically deciding whether or not watermelons can be either seeded or seedless. So these are all ideas of artificial selection that humans have done over history. And we are continuing to do this more and more often. You've also seen CRISPR. So we've already talked about CRISPR and how genetic engineering is becoming a more and more common practice. So this really plays into that genetic engineering idea that we are becoming more and more used to doing as we move forward. So the opposite side of that is a natural selection. So artificial selection is caused by humans. Natural selection is just caused by nature. So over many generations, through this idea of survival of the fittest, natural selection causes changes in the inherited characteristics of a population. So hopefully, these changes increase a species' fitness in the environment. So remember, fitness means survival and reproductive success. So fitness does not mean being able to be the fastest, being the strongest. It just means the species' ability to survive. So that's the whole goal for natural selection. So these are random. These are completely random characteristics, completely random changes that happen. And hopefully, if that random change allows that animal to survive, it'll be reproduced and will happen more and more often. So we'll see that here in a little bit. One example of natural selection that Darwin saw on his journey to the Galapagos Islands was with finches. So each of these are a different type of finch that he saw while on his journey in the Galapagos Islands. Each of these kind of lived on separate islands. So each of these finches had a specific characteristic that helped them survive in their area. So some of them had larger beaks than others in order to eat the certain foods. Some of them had smaller beaks. Some of them had sharper beaks. So each of their characteristics really played into the food as well as the environment that they lived in. So one may think that there is one finch species, but in fact, in this small area, there are many in these different islands. And it all was influenced by the food that's available, the environment that's there. Each of that kind of played into this role. Another example that he saw is that islands had different species. He also looked at tortoises, which we'll see here in a little bit. So a tortoise shell the shape of that tortoise shell corresponded to the different habitats that the animals lived in. So a saddleback shell, which we'll see here in a little bit, and a long neck these animals were able to reach a higher vegetation. So those animals, those species of tortoise lived on an island where food was kind of higher up. So they had to have that long neck in order to reach that food that was located up into the higher trees. Where the dome-shaped shells and shorter neck were those tortoises that lived on islands where that vegetation was closer to the ground. So each of these, even though they lived in a pretty close region of the Galapagos Islands, had completely different characteristics in order to have completely different outcomes of basically reaching for higher vegetation, reaching for higher plants, or reaching for those that are closer to the ground. So we'll see here, this image kind of describes these different types of giant tortoises. So here on the Isabella Island, these had the dome-shaped with the shorter necks. So on the Isabella Island, Darwin noticed that there vegetation was closer to the ground. So they didn't need to find a way in order to reach that food at a higher rate. Whereas those tortoises on Hood Islands had more of a saddleback and a longer neck, because on Hood Island, a lot of the vegetation was higher up. There was very few plants that were located on the ground, so those tortoises had to adapt to its environment in order to reach that food. Another example of evidence that we look at when it comes to evolution is a geographic distribution of living species. So all of these share very similar characteristics. So we have a beaver here in North America, the muskrat that is found in South America, capybara, which is found in northern South America, and then we have the coipu down here in the very bottom of South America. Each of them share very similar characteristics with their varying furs, varying tail shapes, things like that, and each of their characteristics plays into the environment that they live in. So muskrats generally have a shorter fur, as well as capybaras, compared to the beaver. So the beaver lives in North America, where they may have to have thicker furs. So each of these characteristics kind of plays into the environment that they live in. But overall, they still share very similar characteristics. We also look at dinosaur fossils. So in dinosaur fossils, we're able to figure out what environment they may have been influenced or may have been influenced by. So these are both raptors and Tyrannosaurus rex. We can determine by looking at their fossils whether or not they were meat eaters and things like that, whether or not they lived on land or lived in the sea, such as these ammonites, which are more shelled. So with these, we're also able to see how these animals change over time. So an armadillo, these are a common animal found in sort of desert regions, including in North America, are a descendant of these species of dinosaur, where they have that sort of dome that protected their bodies. Now, these are much larger than these armadillos. So scientists argue that with these common characteristics, with this shell, that they must have that the armadillo here must have descended from this species due to their similar characteristics. But the overall size didn't have to be as it was before, so they just got smaller over time, and that similar characteristic of having that protective shell stuck around over that time. Another way that we look at evolution is through what are called homologous body structures. So these are body structures that show common ancestry but do not always have the same function. So these are structures that have different mature forms but develop from the same tissues. So we'll see an example here of a whale flipper and a human hand. So here you can see in this picture here, we have a whale flipper and a human hand. The bone structures are very similar. So you can see here, within a whale flipper, they actually have a thumb, they have 4 fingers, all roughly having the same amount of bones as a human hand. So you can see here, we have our thumbs and we have our 4 fingers. And if you count the number of bones, it is roughly around the same number within a whale's flipper as well as a human hand. Now it is much bigger, because whales are much bigger than humans, of course. But this is a good example of similar structures, but having different functions. And we'll see more of those as we sort of move forward. So another example here is a batwing versus a talon of a bird. So you can see here 5 fingers, each having a nail at the end. Here you also have 5 fingers. So these are an example of homologous structures due to the fact that they have a very similar amount of toes, and they have very similar bone structures within the inside. So this is what scientists argue for, that since they have similar body structures, they must have come from the same species way back when. So this is an ancient lobe-finned fish. This is where scientists believe it all kind of started from, which has very similar bone structures and led to these varying different species. So here you can see each of them have basically a toe muscle. They have some form of forearm muscle here, kind of in the red. They argue that there was maybe some form of elbow bone kind of, or wrist bone that kind of bends. They have that's larger, and it gets larger as you go up. So scientists argue that these kind of show that they have similar body structures. They have similar bone structures as well, so, that prove that they may have descended from a single species. So this is another example of a manatee that has very similar bone structures as what any other species has. Now, vestigial structures. This is another example that maybe shows this change over time. So vestigial structure is any structure that has reduced in size and no longer serves a function, but it may have served a function at one point. So one example are these miniature legs on the skink. So you can kind of see this little nub right here and these little nubs right here, as well as hip bones in whales. So whales have hip bones. These skinks have these little tiny nubs. Each of these no longer serve a function, because why would a whale need a hip if they don't have legs? The skink no longer uses its legs, so it's getting smaller. So these structures have now reduced in size because they're no longer being in use. But maybe at one time in the past they were being used because they were found in their body structure. So animals have these as well. Not only animals have these, but humans do as well. So here are a couple examples of what humans have. So humans have tailbones. Scientists argue that we may have at one point had tails, just because we have that body structure in there. That maybe at one point they were actually served a purpose, but no longer do our tailbones serve a purpose, except for, hurting when we fall. It's kind of a pain. Doesn't feel great when you land on your tailbone. And another example here is an appendix. So an appendix serves a purpose in digesting different greens, things like that. So in more primates, they are useful. But in humans, since our diet doesn't consist exclusively of greens anymore, we no longer have need for an appendix. So our appendices are getting smaller over time, and actually lead to issues. So some of you may have actually already had your appendix removed, but they serve no real purpose within our bodies. So they are considered a vestigial structure due to the fact that they have just gotten smaller and smaller since they're not being in use. Another example is a flightless cormorant. So this is a flightless bird found in the Americas. So over time, you can maybe notice in this picture here that their wings are really small and kind of dainty. The feathers there aren't very strong, aren't very full, because the cormorant hasn't had need to fly away. So there is no predator around there that it needs to escape from. So over time, they have actually developed the ability to no longer fly, or have lost that ability to fly, because they haven't really needed to. Now, the Texas blind salamander is a very interesting species. You can see it here. It's kind of a clear, transparent looking salamander. So these live in caves, and over time, due to the fact that they live in caves, they live in complete darkness, they have lost their eyesight. So you can see here, there actually is no eyeballs here. So they don't have eyes, they don't have eyesight. They use other ways of feeling where they're at, sensing the world around them. So they have kind of developed a higher hearing, a higher feeling, and these sort of structures here on their bodies have kind of gone to that. So these are some extreme cases of vestigial structures where they have completely lost their ability to do different things, have definitely lost some of their overall body structure. So this is another example of how animals have lost different abilities over time. A different type of structure here is analogous structures. So these are body structures that are similar in function but do not show evidence of a common ancestor. So you can see here a porcupine over here and a echidna over here. And what do they have in common is they have their spikes. But they do not share a common ancestor because they live on completely different continents. So they don't believe that there is a common ancestor. Also, you can kind of see their overall face structures. So you can see this one, the echidna has sort of a pointy nose, has a lot smaller than our porcupine, which has a more fuller nose, a fuller face in comparing the two. Another example here are butterflies and birds. So you can clearly see that these two are completely different species. They have completely different body structures, but they both have wings. So an overall idea is, what evolutionary pressure did these species face? So why did they have to develop wings in order to survive? So that is another example of evidence that scientists look at when it comes to evolution and how animals sort of develop these different characteristics in order to become more fit for their environment. So one of the last ones is similarities in embryology. So you will actually be investigating these in the next section of the digital lesson. So that is it for this presentation. If you want to go back and rewatch it and kind of see what questions you may have missed, feel free to go back and rewatch it and answer those questions on the digital lesson. I will see you guys later.